crisis, the climate breakdown.
Destruction of nature can lead to destruction of people.
All Hail the Lockdown examines links between these two crises and asks why it took a pandemic to bring on changes that should have been made long ago.
All these things we were told were completely impossible suddenly become possible.
Connected, the wake-up call that can't be ignored on Aljazeera.
Take the worst possible material, uranium, grind it into dust comparable to flour and make a hill out of it and put it into a place where people live. That is a colossally bad idea.
She's blind.
So many people are sick here. This is a silent killer.
What does it make you feel?
It makes me feel like a murderer. We have created an enormous environmental disaster.
An investigation, South Africa, Toxic City, on Al Jazeera.
This underwater treasure is at risk of disappearing due to coral bleaching caused by rising temperatures.
When we think about what the Great Barrier gives Australia, it's its cultural heritage, it's iconic, and the tourism industry, all of these facets we will lose instantly if we have another bleaching event of these magnitudes.
If this continues, there just will not be the opportunity for the corals to recover in between these major disturbances.
Scientists are calling for stronger climate policy from the government to reduce emissions. Without it, the situation will only get worse.
A top court in the Central African Republic rejects last-ditch appeals to postpone Sunday's election after attacks by armed groups. Hi there, I'm Kim Vanal. This is Al Jazeera Live from Doha. Also coming up, hopes for a turning point in the fight against COVID-19. Countries across the European Union receive their first vaccines and get ready to begin mass immunization. Police in the U.S. city of Nashville say they may have found human remains at the site of a powerful explosion. There's still no clear motive for the attack. And holding on to their voice, the new group of Iraqi writers keeping the nation's rich literary heritage alive. We begin with the Central African Republic and a ruling from the Constitutional Court that Sunday's election will go ahead despite rising violence by armed groups. Opposition parties wanted it postponed and accused the president of vote rigging. Rebels also rejected the legitimacy of the government and threatened to march on the capital, Bangui. 3 UN peacekeepers have been killed. Rights groups are warning that violence could reach levels last seen in 2013 when thousands of civilians were killed. In a moment, we'll hear from the UN, but first, Catherine Soy has more on an election seen as a crucial test for a nation that has suffered years of conflict.
The constitutional judges made this unanimous decision in the courtroom behind me, and they said that the petitioners did not have strong enough grounds to have the election postponed. Now so what this means is that the election is going to go on tomorrow wherever it can. We have spoken to UN officials who say 70% of the country is safe enough for people to come out to vote. We have spoken to the government spokesman who says that yes, they expect a low voter turnout, but they hope that this turnout is not going to be so low as to discredit the process. But there is a lot of fear, not just in areas where there is active fighting, but in places like even Bangui. We have been talking to people who are saying that they will not come to the polling stations until they feel absolutely safe. Their priority is to protect their families. So yes, there's going to be an election, but a lot of tension, really. And we had the president yesterday in his final rally telling the people of Bangui that this Patriots for Change coalition of armed groups are saying that they're coming to the city. He was appealing to the residents of Bangui to be vigilant, to help security forces to block access. And just his words alone just show how precarious the situation is. But people here in Bangui saying, yes, we want to come and vote, but we are really not sure about our safety.
Despite the uncertainty that Catherine mentioned there on the ground, the UN is insisting that conditions are stable enough to ensure a free and fair election. The Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary-General spoke to Aljazeera earlier. She told my colleague Sami Zadam people are determined to exercise their right to vote.
Distribution of the voter cards is ongoing, and people, the electorate of this country who are registered to vote, are coming in large numbers to collect their cards. The population is determined in this country to vote tomorrow, and we are determined at the United Nations, with the support of the international community, to ensure that the vote goes ahead. I've just finished a meeting with all the regional representatives of the country, and in 80% of the country, the situation is progressing. The electoral preparations are ongoing as planned. So in most parts of the country, people will be able to vote tomorrow in security. Yes, in some parts there's instability which is being caused by the armed groups. But as you know, we brought in reinforcements yesterday from our peacekeeping mission in South Sudan to ensure that the vote goes ahead and that the people of this country can vote in security. And our last estimate this morning is that there may be about 4% of the electorate who's not able to vote, but it's absolutely not region-wide. It's very specific communities. And in those communities, our blue helmets, which we call the UN peacekeepers, have reinforced their presence to ensure that people can come. So we are very determined, the population is determined, and we will push back on the armed groups who believe they can steal the elections from the population of this country. International community cannot allow this country to be dragged back to the conflict and chaos of 2013, where innocent people were killed, institutions were upended, and total chaos was reigning in this country. That cannot be allowed, and we can allow them to lead the country back along this path. We have a mandate from the Security Council for which we are responsible to protect the citizens of this country. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, and all of our condolences to the family and the country of the peacekeepers we lost yesterday. But this is what we're here to do. And despite that terrible loss, we have reinforced our presence, and we will remain in this country alongside the people of this country so they can vote as they want to do, as if they have said they want to do tomorrow.
The international community is becoming increasingly concerned that violence could spiral out of control in Central African Republic. Russia, France and Rwanda are deploying military forces in support of the government. Catherine Story reports again now from the capital, Bangui.
President Faustin Archange Touadéra arrives for his final election rally in Bangui in full force. He's been telling people to come out and vote on Sunday without fear. A recently formed group called the Patriots Coalition for Change, or CPC, has threatened to march to the city and launched attacks against government troops backed by UN peacekeepers in some rural areas. The CPC, which is a coalition of several armed groups, has called off a ceasefire it had declared on Wednesday.
They are trying to come to Bangui. You Central Africans must open your eyes. Help our armed forces, UN peacekeepers, MINUSCA, those from Rwanda and Russia. They are giving us a hand. Don't let those armed fighters come into the city.
16 presidential candidates have been cleared to run in the polls, but Jean-Serge Bokassa, son of the country's only self-declared emperor, has withdrawn, citing security concerns. Former President Francois Bozize was disqualified by the Constitutional Court. State officials in the UN accuse him of being behind the CPC rebellion to disrupt the election and overthrow the government. Bozize has backed Anissé Dologele, who's emerged as President Touadéra's strongest challenger.
Vous savez, le président Bozize.
President Bouazizi is the founder of one of the strongest political parties with solid policies. He himself is a very popular leader, but he did not back my candidacy. It's the party that endorsed me.
Most opposition candidates stopped their campaigns a while back and won the election postponed.
Presidential candidates are each promising to finally bring peace back to Central African Republic, revive the economy and provide basic services. But people I've been talking to here in Bangui are saying that they've had these promises before.
Stanislas Rejukuzu knows all about pain caused by conflict. His leg was blown off by a hand grenade when the mostly Muslim armed group Seleka overran Bangui in 2013 and overthrew Bozizé.
Actually, I cannot understand what's happening to me, and I'm scared of what's happening now. They're only coming to kill. I want to ask the government to help us, to stop those who are coming.
Rejukuzu is now preparing to vote in an election clouded by fear and uncertainty. He tells us he'll only go to the polling station if he feels absolutely safe, a sentiment shared by many other voters. Catherine Soy, Aljazeera, Bangui.
At least 35 people have been kidnapped in northeast Nigeria. Armed men dressed in military uniforms set up a roadblock and abducted the travellers as they headed to Maiduguri. It's believed the incident could be linked to Boko Haram. 30 candidates have made their final pitches to voters ahead of elections in Niger. The polls are historic and set the course for the first peaceful transition of power. Ahmed Idris reports from the capital Niamey on how Africa's second coronavirus wave is having an impact.
It's been a busy 3 weeks of campaigning for Niger's presidential candidates. But a new wave of coronavirus infections forced the government to impose a limit on crowd numbers on the last day. But the leading candidates are confident that the right messages have been passed to the voters. Former Foreign and Interior Minister Mohamed Bazoum is the governing party's candidate.
Our candidate has visited all parts of the country even before the start of the campaign, selling practical ideas to the people and to see how people live to understand their problems. That helped us design a program to better people's lives. We're confident of winning in the first round.
One of Bazoum's main rivals, three-time presidential candidate and former Prime Minister Seyni Oumarou, says that won't happen.
In my political experience, it's impossible for anyone to win an election outright in the first round. Each of us would want to, but it's impractical. No one will. It's very, very difficult.
A total of 30 candidates are running for president. While some have campaigned hard, most have been on the sidelines, seeking to form alliances with stronger parties.
Although much of the campaign focused on who becomes president, voters will also choose 171 representatives to fill the seats in this parliament. Some will later form the country's next cabinet. As in previous elections, analysts say Niger may end up with a coalition of one of the main political parties and other smaller ones.
The decision on who gets to form the coalition depends on what 7.5 million voters decide on Sunday. A presidential candidate requires 50% plus one of valid votes cast to win outright. That has never happened in an election here. If no candidate gets that, voters will be called once again to choose among the two candidates with the highest number of votes. Ahmed Idris, Aljazeera, Niamey.
The mutant strand of coronavirus, which caused travel chaos and lockdowns across Britain, is continuing to be detected elsewhere around the world. Sweden has become the latest country to report the more transmissible variant. It was picked up on a traveller arriving from the UK. Elsewhere in Europe, nations are stepping up their efforts to stamp out the virus. Italy has just received its first 10,000 Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines. The first batch of those vaccines has also arrived in Spain, which is due to start its immunisation campaign on Sunday. They'll first be administered at a nursing home. And in Germany, the health minister has called for a major national effort to immunise as many people as possible. That's just hours before its vaccination programme is set to begin. Paul Brennan is in London. He says the virus is having an impact on a usually very busy retail period.
Coronavirus really has hollowed out the high streets, and none more so than here on London's famous Oxford Street, perhaps the most famous shopping street in this country. And over my shoulder you can see how few people there are. We are in the highest level of restrictions here, Tier 4. So strictly speaking, people should be staying at home unless they're out for essential exercise or to go to an essential shop such as a pharmacy. And you can see lots of places are simply closed, and big names too. Topshop over there is closed. Foot Locker on my right-hand side, shut. Primark on my left-hand side also shut. It really has decimated the expectations of the retailers. Now, I've seen one estimate from the credit card company Barclaycard this morning, and they expect Boxing Day people to spend around $3.6 billion online. But that's small consolation to the people with bricks and mortar buildings in places such as this. And the restrictions are expanding. Today, for the first time, an extra 6 million people are under these Tier 4 highest level restrictions, meaning households cannot mix, all essential shops have to close. That brings to a total some 24 million people in Britain, about 43% of the population who are now under these restrictions. And the biggest difficulty over this Christmas period has been how circumstance and the government have bounced people around.
Still ahead on Aljazeera, a new coronavirus trial is underway, looking into using antibodies to help people already infected with COVID-19. And we meet with residents in Delaware, the US state that forged Joe Biden's political career.
Hello, I'm pleased to say that we are losing the wintry weather that we've seen in recent days, if not weeks, across northern parts of Japan. More in the way of rain than snow, but we've still got a few flurries there into the far north of Hokkaido as we go on through Sunday. Further south, well, this wetter weather will become the dominant feature, moving across South Korea and on into Kyushu, easing across a good part of southern Honshu as we go on into Monday. Some very wet weather coming in here with the possibility of some localised flooding. It will sweep through, brighter skies, drier weather comes back in behind. Largely dry across the Korean Peninsula. Chance of one or two wintry flurries there to the eastern side of North Korea. Much of China's looking fine and dry. Cold in Beijing, temperatures no higher than -1 Celsius. We've got some wintry weather across the western side of the country. Got some wintry weather too into the far north of India, northern parts of Pakistan, but for much of South Asia, dry and settled pretty much sums it up. We've got the fog, the smog across northern plains of India. Further south, it's looking pretty quiet at the moment, but this little area of showers drifting in across Sri Lanka will bring some heavy downpours and the possibility of some flooding as we go on through the next couple of days before that wetter weather gradually pushes to Tamil Nadu.
A secret mass grave in Ireland discovered at an institution run by Catholic nuns. A nation shocked to its core. People in Power investigates a scandal that destroyed families, cost thousands of lives, and still raises profound questions about the ties between the Catholic Church and the Irish state. Ireland's mother and baby scandal on Aljazeera.
You're watching Al Jazeera. A reminder of our top stories this hour. The Central African Republic will go ahead with Sunday's presidential election as planned, despite fears of the spread of violence. The Constitutional Court ruled unanimously after a request by opposition candidates to postpone the vote. Voters in Niger are preparing for an election that could see its first democratic transition of power since gaining independence from France 60 years ago. 30 candidates have put their names forward for the presidency as incumbent Mahamadou Issoufou steps down after 9 years in office. COVID-19 vaccine shipments are arriving across the European Union. The first doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine are limited to around 10,000 in most countries, with mass immunisation expected to start in January. Researchers in the UK are starting trials for an antibody treatment that could prevent illness in people infected with COVID-19. It's hoped that the antibody, developed by drug manufacturer AstraZeneca, could prevent the virus developing in people who have already been exposed. A new trial, dubbed Storm Chaser, aims to recruit more than 1,000 people to take part worldwide. Key target groups in the trial will be healthcare workers, people in long-term care, and factory workers. 10 people have been injected with the antibody so far. Dr. Sanjaya Seninyake is an associate professor of infectious diseases at Australian National University. He says the antibody could especially benefit people with weakened immune systems.
One issue with the vaccine is, of course, that the vaccine works by getting our own immune system to make antibodies. So that's fine if we've got a strong immune system that's capable of making antibodies. But what if certain groups don't? And the most common group where this is an issue are elderly people, because they get an aging immune system, which isn't as strong as when they were young. And of course, people who have a very low immune system because they've got a primary immunodeficiency or they're on medications to suppress their immune system. So in those people, the vaccine may not do any harm, but it may not necessarily work as well as in a young, healthy person. So these monoclonal antibodies are an alternative where you just give them the antibody. The immune system doesn't have to make them at all. They haven't done trials directly comparing the vaccine in one arm versus vaccine and monoclonal antibody in another. They really have to do that. But it is possible that it might have an additive effect. We don't know. But certainly in that 82-year-old who gets the vaccine and where we're not confident that the vaccine would work, the monoclonal antibody, if these trials work, would be an alternative. An expensive alternative, but an alternative.
The US city of Nashville is under a curfew after a motorhome exploded in a neighborhood on Friday. It blew up early on Christmas morning after a recorded bomb warning was played. Several buildings were damaged and 3 people suffered injuries. Police haven't been able to establish a motive.
We have found tissue that we believe could be remains, and we'll just have that, examined, and then we'll be able to let you know from that point. The RV was detonated, so if it was someone inside, we have no idea. It was such a large explosion, but the investigation's continuing. There's matter all over the area down there, and so we'll continue to examine that to see if it is human remains.
Shihab Ratanzi is following this from Washington, D.C. He says it's still not clear who was behind the attack.
We're expecting, hopefully, more press conferences in the coming hours. I think all we have right now are questions. I mean, let's go to the beginning. So there was that initial emergency 911 call, which alerted the police that there was something going on in the area. The report was that there were shots being fired there. And at least one person who was living in the area said he heard those shots. What was that about? Who was responsible for those shots? Who was responsible for the 911 call? When the police arrive, they see this motorhome. It's broadcasting a message calling on anyone in the vicinity to evacuate because of an imminent explosion. But the recording suggested the explosion would be within 15 minutes. It didn't occur within 15 minutes. In fact, some people who evacuated were beginning to return to the area when the motorhome exploded. What was that about? Was that intentional? Was that a mistake? It's unclear. And now there's also a great deal of focus being paid to the AT&T switching facility, which was adjacent to the motorhome. Clearly, the destruction and the damage that was caused enormous telecommunications outages, a brief stop at Nashville International Airport, local emergency 911 calls were disrupted. Was that the target? It's not clear. If it was the target, why wasn't the motorhome parked closer to the AT&T facility? And now we have this human tissue that's been found, and it's not entirely clear how widespread it is and whether it was human tissue related to the attack.
US President-elect Joe Biden often talks about his working-class roots in Pennsylvania, but his political career was made representing the tiny state of Delaware. His election to the highest office makes him the first president from Delaware, which is the first state to ratify the US Constitution. Aljazeera's Kristen Salumi takes a closer look at the place the next president calls home.
Delaware traces its European roots back to the 1600s. The city of Newcastle boasts many historic sites, including the courthouse where the state first declared independence from Great Britain, not to mention its more powerful neighbor, Pennsylvania. This landmarked example of federal period architecture belonged to the son of George Reed, one of the signatories of the U.S. Constitution. Like many in the state, tour guide Ann Murphy hopes the first state's first president will finally put Delaware on the map.
I can remember traveling to California one time. They asked me where I'm from, and I said Delaware, and they're, where's that?
Even those who aren't huge fans of Joe Biden can see his election has benefits.
It should bring more tourists, I think, to see where he came from.
It was here in Newcastle that Joe Biden won his first election 50 years ago, taking a seat on the county council. He hasn't lost an election since, and many here see a win for Biden as a win for Delaware. The shipping industry has long since left the shores of this former British colony. These days, Wilmington, home to the Biden transition team, is better known as a tax haven for corporations. Those in the struggling hospitality business are happy the hotels are now full of news media. And more than that, George Taylor is looking forward to the new administration.
He gives that message of hope, and for most black people as myself, I believe he's going to do such a great job, making sure that we are all integrated, we are all united in one America.
It was, in fact, Delaware founding father George Reed who pushed to create the U.S. Senate and guarantee equal representation for smaller states. Turns out politics in Delaware has always been personal.
When you have such a small place, everyone has to get along in some way. And I think that's the tradition that Joe Biden is certainly coming out of, where your senator or your representative, or in this case, your president, is a next-door neighbor. He's just Joe to a lot of people here.
The hope is Joe Biden will now speak for the entire nation, particularly the underrepresented, in keeping with local tradition. Kristen Salumi, Aljazeera, Newcastle, Delaware.
Turkey's defence minister has arrived in Libya despite threats by Eastern warlord Khalifa Haftar. Hulusi Akar promised to increase cooperation with the internationally recognised government in Tripoli. On Friday, Ankara voted to extend the deployment of Turkish troops to Libya for another 18 months. Warlord Haftar, who backs a rival Eastern government, responded with a threat to target Turkish forces. Members of Yemen's new power-sharing government have been sworn in, taking the constitutional oath in the Saudi capital of Riyadh. It was overseen by Yemen's president, who ordered the formation of a new administration after negotiations with the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council. Fighting broke out between the two sides in 2019. Afghanistan's capital has been hit by a series of explosions. At least 5 separate attacks were reported across Kabul. 2 police officers were killed in the worst incident. No group has claimed responsibility. It comes as the Taliban and Afghan government continue talks here in Doha. 2 Palestinians, including a 6-year-old child, have minor injuries after Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. A number of empty sites belonging to Hamas and Islamic Jihad were targeted. A hospital was damaged. Earlier, the Israeli army accused Hamas of firing 2 rockets towards southern Israel. Literary fans are being treated to an online adaptation of Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol, being performed inside the late author's home in London.
The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak, dark night.
The tale of Ebenezer Scrooge is brought to life as viewers see inside the rooms where Dickens wrote the book in the late 1800s. It's the first time the story has been adapted for an online audience. Dickens' home, which now operates as a museum, has been closed most of the year due, of course, to the pandemic. Iraq has produced some of the most celebrated and respected writers in the Arab world. But conflict, sectarianism and political oppression forced many to flee and write from abroad. Now, a new generation is determined to keep Iraq's literary heritage alive. Charles Stratford reports.
Ahmed Khalaf has been writing about the momentous and often violent changes Iraq has suffered for more than half a century. The Baghdad-based author, whose novels, short stories and poems have been published across the Arab world, has had to navigate censorship, political imprisonment and even death threats throughout his career. He acknowledges his contribution to Iraqi literature, but he is saddened by what he says is the lack of impact his work has had.
The country has culturally regressed. People who don't read or write might struggle to develop. Culture across the Arab world is suffering terribly, and Arab writers too. Without freedom to write, how can others learn? I feel I've little effect on people's thoughts.
The bookshops along El Mutanabbi Street, named after a 10th century poet, have been immortalised in Iraqi and Arab culture for centuries. The crumbling Ottoman buildings have witnessed how the pressures on Iraqi writers and readers have changed over the years. The challenge of avoiding jail or worse under the rule of Saddam Hussein, to bomb attacks and kidnapping by Al-Qaeda, ISIL and various armed groups that still have much power in Iraq.
El Mutanabi Street has almost a mythical status in the history of Arabic literature, a place where writers and intellectuals would meet to discuss politics and the arts. But despite the political instability and violence that this country continues to suffer, there is increasing evidence of young writers appearing who are determined not to self-censor and to protect and build on Iraq's literary past.
Bara al-Bayati is a young, recently published Iraqi poet. She owns a bookshop and one of a number of recently opened publishing houses close by. She says half the books in her shop are by new, young Iraqi writers.
We're trying to wake people up from their hibernation. For too long, Iraqis have accepted what we were told. So as young writers, we try to stimulate minds without religion or focus on ethnicity. Instead, we look at a reader's humanity. We're not afraid because we have seen so much. Of course, I sometimes worry about my family, but we have to re-stimulate ideas of civilized things.
At Baghdad's annual international book fair, young people who can afford to buy books including Arabic literature, history, philosophy and translated foreign works.
It is difficult for our generation to find the correct road to walk along, so we depend on ourselves, and through books and reading, I hope we can change the next generation to plant flowers, not thorns, that we find on the path we travel along. We have to read more widely to forge a new future. Young people here definitely seem keen to read.
Hope, at least, that Iraq's literary heritage is being rekindled by a new generation, who say their country's future stability and growth will be helped by young Iraqis reading and writing more. Charles Stratford, Aljazeera, Baghdad.
This is Al Jazeera and these are the top stories. The Central African Republic will go ahead with Sunday's presidential election as planned, despite fears over the spread of violence. The Constitutional Court ruled unanimously after a request by opposition candidates to postpone the vote. Catherine Soy has more from the capital, Bangui.
The constitutional judges made this unanimous decision in the courtroom behind me, and they said that the petitioners did not have strong enough grounds to have the election postponed. Now so what this means is that, as you mentioned, the election is going to go on tomorrow wherever it can. We have spoken to UN officials who say 70% of the country is safe enough for people to come out to vote.
Voters in Niger are preparing for an election that could see its first democratic transition of power since gaining independence from France 60 years ago. 30 candidates have put their names forward for the presidency as incumbent Mahamadou Issoufou steps down after 9 years in office. Countries across Europe are receiving their first shipments of coronavirus vaccines. Inoculations start in some places on Sunday, beginning with people in elderly care homes. The European Commission president remains optimistic the end is near, but Ursula von der Leyen says it's still important to be careful. The U.S. city of Nashville is under a curfew after a motorhome exploded in a neighborhood on Friday. It blew up early on Christmas morning after a recorded bomb warning was played. Several buildings were damaged and 3 people suffered injuries. Police haven't been able to establish a motive. Turkey's defense minister has arrived in Libya despite threats by Eastern warlord Khalifa Haftar. Hulusi Akar promised to increase cooperation with the internationally recognized government in Tripoli. On Friday, Ankara voted to extend the deployment of Turkish troops to Libya for another 18 months. Warlord Haftar responded with a threat to target Turkish forces.